So before we get too far with the homework, let's see if we can just make it look a little less bland. Believe it or not, my HTML has changed very, very little between these two. That is almost all CSS. Christmas here, this isn't an image. This is a font. Yeah, this is all text. And look at that. Look at. Oh. So if you look real close here, it's got some green and some red around it. Oh yeah, we got all kinds of glowy effects. Yeah. All right. Let's see what we can do with that. This is not obviously a CSS boot camp. It's not the emphasis of the course, but I'll try to show you a few tricks along the way. If you're interested in that kind of thing, I want to be sure to share some info with you. If it's not your thing, and if you think it'll just distract you, just tune out while I do this. But I'm going to do just a little of this in class. Yeah.
So the course is kind of like focuses on mainly JavaScript and HTML.
Mostly JavaScript. I mean, it's mostly actual programming. So we're working our way toward React. It's just you have to know a little of those other things to make them work too. HTML, not too complicated. We can learn enough along the way. CSS, we only have 3 weeks. So, and if your stuff looks ugly but works, then that's quite all right. So let's see if we can make it look a little more interesting here. So the only difference in my HTML here, there's very, very little that I did to it. So first, I wrapped my H1 in a heading. So HTML5 added some new elements that functionally are no different than divs. They're just semantically more meaningful. So they can make your code a little more descriptive. So things like heading, footer, main, article, aside, section, stuff like that. They're no different from divs, but it kind of makes your markup a little prettier and more structured, so it feels good to do that. So I want to wrap my H1 in something, so I'm going to call it heading because that tag's available now, and that's what it is. I meant header, not heading. Header. This is the header of the page, as opposed to the footer. And then I threw an H2 under that. H2 that says a whole mess of Chris's. And then I did one more little wrapper here. So in my form, I put the input in the button inside a div, just so that I had something else I could target with CSS. It used to be in HTML4 that, according to the spec, it was actually illegal to have an input directly inside a form without another block level element in between. I don't think HTML5 says that anymore. It was never enforced, of course, but that's what the spec said. But I want an element in between so I can style it. And the only other thing that I changed in the HTML was I added an image, which is this little decorative thingy here. So everything else was pure CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the images that I used in here. So I'm going to right-click on one of my files in Visual Studio Code, say Reveal in Finder. On Windows, that would be Reveal in Explorer. That'll open it up. I'll copy in my 2 images, which are Chris.jpg, which is the eyes, and decoration.ping, which is that thingy. So I'll just copy those in there. I'll drop those in Slack, and hopefully that doesn't coincide with Slack going down for everybody. It made it look like my uploading those 2 images like broke Slack nationwide or worldwide. I don't think that was it, but we'll try again. There we go. So if you want those images, there they are. They're on the way. But of course, they'll be in my repo here pretty shortly too. So again, the only other change I made in HTML was to add an image. So IMG, it's another empty element, right? There's no closing tag, just like input. Source is just the path to the file, and it's right here in the same directory, so decoration.ping. The alt attribute should not be considered optional. Of course, it's not going to refuse to show your image if you leave it out, but you should not leave it out. It is okay, however, to leave it blank like this if that's appropriate. The alt attribute tells what text should display if the image can't load for whatever reason, which also means that's what's going to get read aloud if you're using a screen reader or other assistive technology. So in the case of this thing, this is purely decorative. So we don't really want it to read something out loud if it's not there. It's totally decorative, so I'm just going to leave it as an empty string. And there. Now I've updated my HTML, all that I'm going to. So refresh. Looks terrific, right? Yeah, those.
If you're creating like professional, or not professional, if you're professional, you're creating like websites and
Yeah.
stuff like that, like content development. Would you say that it's good practice to add, to like put something for the what's it called, alt?
Absolutely. I mean, it is, yeah. It totally depends on if there weren't an image there, would you need something else there to convey the same information? Like in the case of the swirly thing, no. But in the case of, it's a bad idea to do text as an image. But should you? Should you for whatever reason? Or should you say use an icon? Like you have a button for adding something. And your button is a little icon that looks like a plus. If that image, if that icon didn't load for some reason, you would need some text there so that they knew what to do with that button, right? It would need to say something like add a new flick. Know what I mean? So if there's something else, if that image is actually conveying some information, then you need to provide an alt attribute to convey the same information another way. So yeah, absolutely. In this case, I would leave it blank, but in many cases you would not. But this is purely decorative, so it's okay. All right, so everything else I said was CSS. So let's see if we can make this look a little less terrible through the power of style sheets. So first of all, I picked out another font to use for this. I totally just went to Google Fonts, found another one that I liked, got a new URL. The one I found was Parisien. So the new URL I got was like this. And so now what I want to do is style just the H1 with that font. Font family, Parisien. Mais oui. Fall back to any old cursive font should that not be there. Beautiful. And what else? I want that H1 to be centered, so text align center. Very good. I want to style the header itself. So I'll go ahead and put that above here. So this whole header section up here. That image of all the eyeballs, I just added that as a background image to the header. So let's do that. Background image in CSS. Anatomy of a CSS rule. First you have a selector, which are just the same as those things we put inside query selector, right? And then we have curly braces, and then we have a series of properties and their values. And the properties in CSS, if they're multi-word, you separate them with dashes or hyphens. Followed by a colon, followed by the value. So for background image, that is URL, open close parens, and then the path to the image. And always a semicolon at the end. They are not optional. This is not JavaScript. And it is just chris.jpg. Let's have a look at that. Beautiful. Just what we were looking for, right? Okay, that's a little terrifying. So when I'm writing CSS, I often just go into the developer tools and fiddle around with it until it looks the way I want. And then I copy what I've done back into my style sheet. So let's have a look at this header. I'm going to right click on it, say inspect. Now I've got my header. I can see my CSS down here. So I'm going to play around with it. So I need to change the background size. Background size. Here are the possibilities. Auto, contain, cover, inherit, initial, and unset. I happen to know that cover is what I want. So both cover and contain will resize them to fit. Now, since I haven't given my header a size, cover isn't going to do quite what I want yet. But I know that long term, that's the one I actually want. So that makes the whole thing fit, right? Unfortunately, it's still like repeating. contain. So I want the header to actually have a constrained height. So what I'm going to do is set the height, and there are several units you can use for determining the size of things in CSS. You could use good old pixels. I tend to stay away from pixels just because people can resize their fonts and everything, and things will get bigger and smaller. So they're not really going to be pixels long term. So I kind of don't fiddle with pixels very much. I'll usually use one of the relative units. So there's things like EM, which is relative to the font size. REM, R-E-M, which is relative to the base font size for the entire page. I use that one a lot. There's percentages, which is a percentage of the container's width. And there's VW and VH, viewport width and viewport height, which means the width of the window or the height of the window. In this case, I'm going to make it relative to the width of the window because I want the size of the header to actually change depending on how big the window is or how wide the window is. And the truth is, I just fiddled with this until I found one that I liked. I knew it was probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of, like, I don't know, 14 view width. So what that means is 14% of the width of the entire viewport. And that doesn't look quite right. That's showing too much. If I go down to about 10, that's not enough because I see another Evans eyeball there. 11 seems about right. That might be different, though, if I get rid of that padding. I don't know. That seems about right, but you can always say background repeat, no repeat, too. Background repeat, no repeat. And so that seems fairly legit. What else do I want to do with this header? I'll leave it at that for now. So let me copy these rules and actually put them in my style sheet. There we go. Refresh. Okay, still looks the same. But there's some margin around the top here that I don't want. So the body itself looks like it has some margin. So just because it's built into the browser, there's margin of 8 pixels on the body. Do not want. So margin 0. There's still a bunch of space there. That must be because of the H1. Yeah, the H1 has a bunch of margin. Do not want. H1, margin 0. Now we're talking, and now it looks like my 11 VW is not quite right. So, how about 12? 12 seems good. I might tweak that again one more time because now I think I do want a little bit of border around this thing. So let's put a nice border around my entire header. Border. I'll make it about half a rim wide, solid white. Yeah, I like it. All right, good. Now, I still don't like the way this looks. It should be bigger. It's unreadable in black, so let's fiddle with that. Here's my H1. I'll select it. Let's make the color white. But then we get some, yeah, it's not big enough. So I will again make it relative to the width of the page because I want it to resize as I resize the page. So font size colon something like 15 VW. That's nice and big. Now I've got some white on white, so that's a problem. So I'm going to solve this by putting some shadow underneath it. There's a text shadow property. I'm not going to get into the gruesome details about how that works. So let's just practice. If you didn't know and you were curious, because I'm not going to go into great detail, just Google CSS text shadow. First result is W3 schools. It very often will be. You'll typically see W3 schools, MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, and CSS tricks as the top 3 results when you look up CSS stuff. Nice thing about W3 schools, it's pretty clear usually, and it always gives you a little try it yourself button. And so you can fiddle around with the values and see what changes. So if I change this 2 pixels to 20 pixels and run, you can see what that does. So it gives you an idea of what if I change it to 7. So you can see kind of what that property does if you fiddle with it. I find that CSS tricks tends to have the the most detail in the explanations that work best for me, but your mileage may vary. So anyway, what I'm going to do is put a couple of shadows on this. I'm going to put a red shadow and a green shadow. That'll make it stand out from the white background. Oh yeah, but I needed to put my other styles there. All right, I forgot about those. So color white, font size, 15 VW. Oh yeah. Behold its majesty. Okay, that's a little big. A little bigger than I intended. That's because I didn't mean header. I meant the H1. Now we're talking. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. All right, so let's see. Yeah, it gets bigger. It's always there looping around Hemsworth's eye, just real nice like that. Looks like a fancy monocle. All right. So we'll style some of the rest of this. Nothing too terribly interesting. The H2. I'll center it. I'll give it a negative top margin so that it goes a little closer to this, because it's leaving way more space for that H1 than I really need. So I want this to be a little closer to that, so I'll give it some negative top margin. Totally works. Put it where I want. Now it's not leaving room for my form here. My form's way too high on the page, and this image is way too dang big. So let's fix that image. So here's the first selector that I'm going to use that's different than what we've learned so far. Header space image. You know what that means? You know what that space means? Catherine, are you just rocking back and forth? You know what that means?
Well, I've learned it, but I'm trying to decide which way it goes.
So I'll give you... So the last thing in the list is always the element actually being styled. This is styling the image. So what does that selector mean? It's an image that is a descendant of a header. So it means it's inside the other. So this is a descendant selector, putting a space between things. That means an image element that is inside a header element. Like this, right? The image is inside the header. So just in case I have other images on the page later, I don't want this CSS rule to apply to them. I just want it to apply to this one. This would apply to all of them. So if I didn't want that, I'd need to use a class or something else, right? Yep. So this will apply to any image that is inside there. So it always works like query selector all in CSS. All right, that's more like it. So now we just don't have, we're not leaving enough room for our flick. So I'm just going to put some bottom margin on the header to deal with that. There are other things I could do, but that's the route I decided to go. So I'm just going to put some serious bottom margin on this. A quick note about the rules I put here. So images by default are inline elements. You remember inline versus block? We talked about block elements are things like paragraphs, where there's automatically a line break before and after. So block elements take up an entire line. Inline elements do not. They can appear alongside other elements. And images by default are inline. But I want this thing to take up an entire row, so I'm changing it to be block. You can do that with the display property. All right, now that's way down here. I'm going to style that a bit. I'm going to style the actual form just to give it a little bit of padding so it's not hugging the left side here. So I'll just target the form, give it some padding, no big deal. Boop. And then I made one other small change to my HTML, right? I put this div in here so that I could style it. And that's so that I could do this. So I'm using something called Flexbox to lay out my page. So Flexbox was a gift from heaven for those of us who've been writing CSS a long time, because page layout has always been kind of a nightmare on the web. Flexbox finally gave us something that really works. And since then, there's even grid layout, which is newer yet and also very cool. It's a whole thing, so we won't get into it in excruciating detail, but there's a wonderful guide for it on CSS Tricks. If you'll notice their placeholder on their search box, Flexbox is their suggested search. And I'm into that suggestion. So they have a complete guide to Flexbox. If you're curious about how this works, check it out. It's great stuff. But one of the things you do with Flexbox is you tell it what to do with any space that's left over. So what I'm saying here is I want to use Flexbox inside this div. Oh, this, by the way, child selector. Very similar to leaving a space, except the difference is with a space, there could be elements in between. With a child selector, the greater than sign, that means this div must be immediately inside the form. It doesn't have to be the first thing inside the form. There just can't be a whole nother layer of elements in between the two. It's a child, not just a descendant. Yeah.
So in HTML, we learned that H1, H2, H3 it doesn't mean like the numbers don't mean like a system of precedence. It means like how big the text is.
Right.
So in CSS, I see that you're putting like H1 and having some brackets, which means that you're gonna be editing H1. But what if in your HTML and on a web page in general, you have multiple elements that are H1? How do you get CSS to distinguish between different text?
So the way I've written this rule, it's just going to style them all this way. But otherwise, you could use classes and stuff. So just like we did with query selector, right? You could say h1.fancy or whatever, and that would target only those with a certain class. So if you have some you want to target with a rule and some you don't, you can always use classes. Yep. That's what classes are for, really, is CSS. But now that we have query selector, we use them all the time in JavaScript too. So this just says use Flexbox, take up the whole width, and what should you do with the extra space that's there? You should make the other elements stretch to fill it. So this isn't going to do much just yet until I do some more. But I'm setting myself up. And I will admit I got a little carried away styling the input field and the button. So I'm just going to kind of drop all this in here at once. And yeah, I kind of went nuts. And that gives me this. Totally worth it. So I won't go over all of this, but if you want to look over it and look up some of these properties on CSS tricks and whatnot and see what they do, feel free. Some of it's kind of interesting. Some of it probably is horribly boring. But if you're into that kind of thing, feel free to check it out. I also use some fancier selectors. Like this is an attribute selector. This says not just an input, but an input with a type of text. The comma, you can always put commas between separators, and it will apply the same rule to multiple types of elements. This one's kind of interesting. Flex. That is a combination of several different properties, but one of them is flex grow 4. So what I'm saying there is if there's extra space on this row after you put the input and the button, I want 4 times as much of that extra space to go toward the input as goes toward the button. So if there's space left over, give most of that extra space to the input because the button doesn't need to be that big. So that's what that does. Here's another interesting one, box sizing border box. Anybody familiar with this already? So if you inspect an element in the dev tools, it'll show you how much margin, border, padding, and so on that there is with the actual element itself here in the center. So when you apply a width to an element, how much of that would you expect to be covered by that? Would you expect the width to be just this innermost box, or that plus the padding, or that plus the border, or the whole thing, or what? What would you expect? You probably don't know what you would expect until you've done it enough times and started to wish that it worked a certain way. Well, the way it actually works in the standard DOM is that width applies only to the actual element itself. Logically, it kind of seems like it ought to include the padding and border, because the margin is really the space between elements. And you end up with a problem. If you're saying, I want this thing to fill its entire container. Okay, I set width equal to 100%. But I want some padding inside there, or I want it to have a border inside there. Well, if I add a border and padding, then all of a sudden I'm bigger than my container. But if I want the padding to be, say, 5 pixels, how do I say 100% minus 5 pixels, minus the 5 pixels on the other side? Well, there is an answer to that question. But one nice thing is you can say box sizing border box, and that means now width includes padding and border, which when that's what you need, it's awfully nice to have. That's a relatively new, I mean, it's been years now, but new to me. So I style the input. And check it out here. When I unfocus it and when I focus it, watch when I focus it. Zoop. Now when I unfocus it, zoop. See, it kind of the border kind of fades. It's a zoop, 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 zoop. Yeah. So we got some style there. It's pretty groovy. All right, looking pretty nice. Pretty nice. Style the page. Any questions?